My wife said she was going to her mother's house, but when she came back, she brought with her an intense smell of men's perfume. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't my imagination. The sweet, woody aroma was permeated through her clothes, her hair, her skin. When she entered the house, she threw her keys on the table, gave me a quick kiss and walked away as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But it was. God knows how it was. I stood there, still, watching every detail, every movement, every breath of hers, trying to process the invisible evidence that screamed in front of me. The smell. The damn smell that wasn't mine, that wasn't hers, that didn't belong in this house. It was from another man. My heart accelerated. I felt my stomach drop, a mixture of anger and disbelief taking over me. I didn't want to believe the obvious. I didn't want to accept that the woman I loved, who I protected, who I put above everything else, could be cheating on me. But that perfume didn't lie. My mind started racing for clues, looking for times when I had been naive, times when perhaps she had shown signs and I simply hadn't noticed. The cell phone she took to the bathroom. The messages she never let me see. Exits without convincing explanation. My God, how many times have I ignored what was right in front of my face? That night, as she slept next to me, I couldn't sleep. The heat from her body disgusted me. Every time he turned over in bed, his perfume mixed with his scent suffocated me. My thoughts became obsessive, detail-oriented, paranoid. If that was what I thought it was, I needed to know. I needed to be sure. I couldn't make any decision without concrete evidence. He couldn't destroy a marriage based on instinct, no matter how strong it was. I needed proof. So, I investigated. I began to observe her with different eyes. Every day, my suspicion became more concrete. She was happier than usual, as if something or someone was nurturing her inside. She laughed to herself, played with her cell phone and bit her lip, like a teenager in love. He made a point of dressing up more than usual, new clothes, lingerie that he never showed me. And then, the slips came. Small details that became glaring evidence. A dinner with her mother that was cancelled at the last minute, but she left anyway. A coffee with a friend that never happened. Calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. With each clue that emerged, I fell deeper into the hole of distrust. It was then that I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I thought I would ever do, but it was necessary. I took the car that night and waited. She left the house punctually, driving with a lightness that disgusted me. I followed her from afar, sweaty hands on the steering wheel, feeling my heart hammering against my chest as if it wanted to break my flesh. She didn't go to her mother's house. Not even for work. Not even for a casual meeting with a friend. She went to a hotel. My vision became blurred. My entire body was shaking. I saw her park and get out of the car. I saw him enter the lobby with an eager smile on his lips. I saw a man waiting for her at the reception. They hugged. Far away. Intimate. Suit. As if they belonged together. As if I didn't exist. As if our marriage was nothing more than a forgotten burden. My world fell apart. The pain I felt was like a blade piercing my chest. The humiliation burned my skin like acid. I wanted to run there, scream, rip them out, destroy everything. But I couldn't. Not yet. Betrayal was not avenged in the heat of the moment. Betrayal was avenged through coldness, intelligence, and patience. In cruelty. I went home that night knowing nothing would be the same. I had buried the man who trusted her. The passionate, dedicated, loyal husband. The fool. I needed to act, but meticulously. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a scene, of a scandal. I wouldn't allow myself to become the villain. I would destroy her life in the right way, at the right time, and make her feel every bit of the pain that now consumed me. So, I started planning. My sleepless nights became dedicated to charting her fall. Coldness took over my being. There was no more love, only strategy. The divorce? It would be merciless. And the lover? He would not come out of this story unscathed. But, in the middle of all this plot, I discovered something I could never have imagined. That man wasn't just any lover. He was a scammer. A manipulator. A parasite that fed on the fragility of married women and destroyed them without them realizing it. The kind of man who sucks in everything he can before disappearing at the most convenient time. And my wife, my cheating wife, was about to be his next victim. But now, I had control. Now, I was ahead of the game. She thought she had tricked me, that I was the idiot who would be on her knees crying while she slept with someone else. But the tables had turned. I had a choice, let her fall and watch from afar, or push her straight into the abyss. What did I do? Well, that's the part you don't know yet. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never justify betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry deep truths about how infidelity can destroy lives, families, and hearts. Every choice has its consequences, and in this story, you will see this in a clear way. Raw and relentless. Get ready for an intense narrative, full of twists, pain and revenge. A story that will captivate you from beginning to end. Now, adjust your headphones, take a deep breath and get ready, the shock is about to begin. Michael and Sophia's house was spotless. Every piece of furniture, every decorative object, every detail meticulously thought out and positioned, reflected the life they had built together over the years. The sturdy dark wood dining table where so many conversations were exchanged, the leather sofa where they shared weekends watching movies, the photos on the shelves, the small love notes that he left glued to the bathroom mirror and which, over time, were no longer answered with the same frequency. Everything there told the story of a couple who, in anyone's eyes, had a solid marriage. The facade of their lives was perfect. But what is there behind a facade, if not layers of truths and illusions that coexist without anyone noticing the fine line that separates one from the other? Michael has always been a methodical man. I worked as a financial analyst at an investment company and had a stable, predictable routine. I liked that. I wish I knew exactly what to expect the next day. He planned his commitments with precision and, in his marriage, he carried the same organization. He was the type of husband who remembered special dates, who sent loving messages throughout the day, who brought flowers for no apparent reason. But lately, something inside him felt that this effort seemed like a monologue. An empty echo that found no response. Sophia, who had always been an affectionate woman, seemed distant. The time you used to spend together was slowly being replaced by small excuses. I was tired. I needed to resolve something at work. He was going out with a friend he had never met in person. Gradually, conversations that had previously flowed effortlessly began to be filled with silence, and Michael, without realizing it, began to speak less and less. Sophia was an elegant woman, with a striking look and a smile that could disarm anyone. He worked at a marketing agency and had a busier social life than Michael. I liked the feeling of being surrounded by people, of being admired, of feeling that I still had the power to attract attention. Marriage, as much as it was something she cherished, began to become too predictable for her. The days blended into a monotonous routine, and the enchantment of the first years no longer existed with the same intensity. She wasn't sure when this feeling started, but at some point, she realized that she found herself sighing for something she couldn't even define exactly. I just felt empty. Time passed, and what was just a slight discomfort inside her became a growing restlessness. Sophia started to dress up more than usual. She started buying lingerie that she never wore with Michael, spending more time in the mirror, smiling at messages on her cell phone that she quickly deleted. Small details that, if observed in isolation, seemed insignificant, but, together, painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Michael noticed these changes, but preferred to silence his concerns. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a phase. He wanted to believe so. The weekends, previously full of couples programs, were now filled with Sophia's commitments that did not include Michael. A dinner with friends, an agency event, a spa day that, curiously, was repeated more than usual. He tried not to question it. But what was once blind trust gave way to doubts he didn't want to have. Michael began to notice the way Sophia distanced herself for no apparent reason. The way she avoided eye contact at certain times, as if she was carrying a weight she didn't want to share. The way she became impatient when he asked simple questions about her routine. Small changes that accumulated like pieces of a puzzle, but still didn't form a clear picture. And then came the nights when she wasn't there. The first time he said he would sleep at his mother's house, Michael saw no reason to doubt it. But then it happened again. And again. And, with each return, she seemed more radiant, lighter. Her scent seemed different. And it was at that moment that Michael began to understand that something was wrong. But what do you do when all you have are sensations? How do you react and there is no concrete evidence, just an uncomfortable feeling that refuses to go away? Michael tried to ignore it, tried to stifle his doubts, tried to convince himself that he was just imagining things. But the truth is, once you plant the seed of distrust, it grows on its own. And when the moment of discovery finally arrives, there is no turning back. That perfect house, that marriage admired by everyone, was starting to crack. And Michael didn't know it yet, but the life he knew was about to change forever. Time seemed to slip through Michael's fingers like fine sand, and with each day that passed, the feeling that something was wrong only grew. He tried to convince himself that it was just paranoia, that he was seeing things where there were nothing, but the truth was that the signs were everywhere, screaming for his attention. The nights Sophia spent away from home became more frequent, and the excuses increasingly vague. The conversations between them, which were already fragile, became mere greetings, automatic phrases without any depth. There was a suffocating silence between the two, as if they both knew something was falling apart, but neither had the courage to say it out loud. Michael felt a weight in his chest every time she left, every time her phone vibrated and she hid the screen, every time her eyes sparkled with something that clearly wasn't him. He didn't want to be the kind of man who spies on his wife, who gives in to irrational jealousy, who destroys his own sanity trying to control the uncontrollable. But what if he wasn't imagining it? What if your intuition was right? It was one night, after Sophia announced another one of her trips to her mother's house, that Michael finally decided to act. He waited for her to leave, waited a few minutes to make sure she wouldn't come back, and then grabbed his car keys, driving aimlessly as his mind raced. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, he didn't know what he expected to find, but he felt like he couldn't ignore it any longer. His heart hammered hard in his chest, as if bracing itself for an inevitable impact. Following Sophia seemed like an insane idea, but it was the only way to get the answers he so desperately needed. He kept a safe distance, watching as she drove leisurely through the brightly lit streets, without a trace of nervousness or hesitation. If she was lying to him, she was doing it with frightening ease. Michael felt a pang of anger shoot through him when he saw her park not at her mother's house, but at a small, out-of-the-way hotel. The impact of the scene was so strong that he needed a few seconds to process it. His body froze, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes stared at the door through which Sophia had just disappeared. Reality was drawn before him, cruel, brutal, definitive. All the doubts, all the suspicions, everything he had tried to ignore for fear of being wrong, was now there, out in the open. He didn't want to believe it. Part of him still searched for a logical explanation, a plausible justification that would ease the suffocating tightness in his chest. But then, confirmation came relentlessly. The hotel door opened again, and he saw the man. Tall, elegant, confident. The type of man who always attracted attention when he entered a room. He smiled at Sophia, and she returned it with a sparkle in her eyes that Michael hadn't seen in a long time. A glow that was once his, but now belonged to someone else. The man put his arm around her waist, and the two disappeared into the hotel. Michael felt his stomach turn, his heart pounding against his ribs as if it wanted to escape. He wanted to get out of the car, he wanted to scream, he wanted to confront her right there, but he couldn't move. The pain was overwhelming, too intense to allow any action. He just stood there, watching his wife lose herself in another man's arms, feeling his life fall apart in slow motion. Anger came soon after. Not only did she cheat on him, but she did it with a smile on her face, without the slightest trace of guilt or hesitation. Everything they lived together, all the years of complicity, all the moments shared, now seemed like a big lie. The woman he loved, that he protected, that he thought he knew so well, was just a stranger. He felt his hands shake, his thoughts shuffle into a chaotic mix of anger and despair. But no, he wouldn't act on impulse. He wouldn't give her the pleasure of seeing him out of control, humiliated, begging for answers. If she wanted to play with him, if she thought she could betray him without consequences, she was wrong. Michael didn't come home that night. He drove aimlessly, trying to calm the storm inside him, trying to find some logic in the chaos. He wanted to cry, he wanted to scream, he wanted to break something, but all he could do was stare at the emptiness before him. He knew this was just the beginning. Whatever was behind that betrayal was not yet fully revealed. And he would make a point of finding out. Michael spent days absorbing the impact of the betrayal, but the pain did not turn into grief. Instead, something inside him awakened, something he had never felt before, an uncontrollable need for justice, for revenge, to not emerge from this story as the betrayed man who swallows the humiliation and moves on with his head down. No, he would not be that man. He would not allow Sophia to live her lie without consequences. Her world would fall apart just as his had fallen apart. And for that, he needed to know everything. Every detail. Every lie. Every secret she kept. The investigation began subtly. Michael didn't ask direct questions, didn't confront Sophia with accusations. On the contrary, he maintained the mask of the distracted husband, of the man who still believed the story she told. He waited patiently until she relaxed, until her confidence in her own lie left her careless. And that's when he acted. He took her cell phone while she was sleeping. Unlocking it was easier than I imagined. She never thought he would do that. What he found there was worse than anything he had imagined. Messages. Photos. Bank transactions. Constant deposits of small amounts sent to an unknown account. One conversation in particular caught his attention. It was between Sophia and a man named Daniel. The name was familiar to him, but he couldn't remember where. As I read the messages, a pattern began to form. The man was not just a lover. He asked for money. Small amounts at the beginning, but they increased over time. And Sophia, blinded by the illusion she lived, paid without question. But why? Who was this man, anyway? Michael decided to find out. Hired a private investigator. Money had never been a problem for him, and now, every penny invested in destroying Sophia was worth it. The reports came faster than expected. And then, the truth dawned before his eyes. Daniel was no ordinary man. He was a professional scammer. A man who seduced married women, made them believe in overwhelming passion, and slowly drained their finances, their dignity, their life. Sophia wasn't the first, and she certainly wouldn't be the last. The impact of the discovery was devastating. The woman who destroyed a marriage over a love affair was just another victim of a well-articulated scheme. But Michael didn't feel sorry. I felt angry. She was not innocent. He had made his choices, he had destroyed everything they had built, and now he would face the consequences. But he needed to be strategic. It wasn't enough to confront her. He needed to make her see with her own eyes the destruction she had caused. He waited for the right moment. That night, Sophia left again, with the usual excuse. He didn't follow her. I already knew where she was going. But this time, he was one step ahead. While she was with Daniel, Michael gathered evidence. Every message, every deposit, every bank transaction. The next day, he sat at the breakfast table with a calm expression. Sophia entered the kitchen without suspecting anything, gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, as she did every day, and took out her cell phone. But when he tried to unlock it, he realized something was wrong. The password had been changed. She looked at him, confused, and laughed nervously. She asked if he had touched her cell phone, but Michael just smiled, sliding the device across the table to her. He told me to try to unlock it. When she couldn't, his smile disappeared. In a low voice, he said he knew. That he had seen everything. Who knew who Daniel was? Who knew what she did when she said she was with her mother? Sophia's face turned pale. She tried to argue, to say he was exaggerating, but Michael didn't give her a chance. Showed the messages. Transfer receipts. Every piece of evidence he had collected. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to touch his hand, but he pulled away. He asked, his voice full of pain and contempt, if it had even been real. If at some point, that story had been about love, or if it had always just been about ego, about adventure, about her need for something new. Sophia cried. She tried to say that she had been weak, that she never wanted to hurt him, that she still loved him. But her words were now empty. Nothing he said would change what he had done. It was then that Michael delivered the final blow. He picked up an envelope from the table and slid it over to her. Inside were the divorce documents. But it was no ordinary divorce. It was a cold, meticulous divorce, designed to leave Sophia with as little as possible. He looked her in the eyes and told her that while she gave herself to Daniel, he made sure to protect everything he built. The house. The money. The name. Sophia would be left with nothing but shame and humiliation. She broke down right there, sobbing, begging for a second chance. But for Michael, there was nothing more to be said. He got up, picked up his suitcase, which had been packed for days, and walked out the door without looking back. Sophia stood there, alone, surrounded by the wreckage of the life she destroyed. And Daniel? Well, he would soon discover that the source of money had dried up. And when that happened, Sophia would know true loneliness. Michael walked out of the house without looking back. The cold night air hit his face, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were a whirlwind of images and sounds, fragments of what had just happened mixing with the confusion that still echoed within him. He had done what needed to be done. He had dismantled the hoax, exposed the truth, shown Sophia the weight of her choices. But why, then, did I still feel that emptiness inside my chest? It wasn't relief, it wasn't complete revenge, it was just an all-consuming black hole, a feeling that even with everything resolved, something was still trapped inside him. What more could be left to be said? He got into the car, threw his suitcase on the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel tightly. He needed to get out of there, put miles between him and that woman, that ruined marriage, that story that he never imagined would end like this. He started the engine, but then he heard something. A muffled sound, a scream coming from inside the house. Sophie. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the anger boil inside him. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want anything more from her. But she screamed again, this time louder. Calling for him. Begging. Michael's hands shook on the steering wheel. Every part of him said to go away. But something inside him, perhaps the part that still remembered the woman he once loved, made him let out a long sigh before opening the car door again. He walked up the steps of the house, pushed open the door unceremoniously, and found Sophia kneeling in the middle of the room, divorce papers scattered around her, her shoulders shaking as sobs tore from her throat. Smeared makeup ran down her face, her eyes were red, despair etched into every feature of her expression. It was a pathetic image. But it was real. He stood there, standing, watching. Waiting. Without saying anything. I wanted to see what she would say, what she still had the audacity to ask. Sophia slowly lifted her head, her eyes boring into him as if she were seeing a ghost. Her voice was weak, almost unrecognizable. He asked why. He asked how he could just erase everything, how he could not even give her a chance to explain. Michael laughed, a dry, acidic laugh, full of irony. Explain. What else was there to explain? He saw her enter that hotel, he saw with his own eyes the smiles she never gave him again, he felt every lie she told without hesitation. What kind of explanation would justify all that? Sophia staggered to her feet, her eyes pleading. She said it was a mistake, that she didn't know what she was thinking, that she was confused. He tried to take his hand, but Michael took a step back. She asked him to listen to her, just one last time. Her voice shook as she confessed that she had nowhere else to go, that Daniel wasn't who she thought he was, that he no longer answered her calls. Michael narrowed his eyes, feeling the pang of satisfaction that came with those words. The coup had taken place. Daniel abandoned her at the exact moment he saw that he could no longer take anything from her. Sophia cried harder, fell down on the sofa, clutching her arms as if trying to hold on. He said he didn't know how it all got to that point, that he never wanted to hurt him, that he still loved him. Who always loved him? Michael crossed his arms, remaining still, feeling his fury growing. Love? Did she still have the courage to say that word? He asked if she called the nights she spent in another man's bed love, if she called the lies, the secrets, the betrayal love. He asked if she even realized what she destroyed, if she even had a moment of guilt before giving herself over to it. Sophia swallowed hard, her sobs muffled by the guilt that finally seemed to overtake her. He admitted that he had been selfish, that he had lost himself in something he thought he wanted, but now he saw that all he did was throw away the only true thing he had. She tried to justify it, saying that she felt forgotten, that she wanted something new, that she wanted to feel desired. But her words fell to the floor like broken glass. They didn't make any difference now. Nothing could justify what she did. Michael sighed, running a hand over his face, feeling the weight of everything on him. He said she was not the victim. He said she made choices. He chose to lie. He chose to betray. He chose to end it all. And now he had to deal with it. She choked on her own tears, holding the divorce papers in her shaking hands. He asked if it was really over. If there was absolutely nothing she could do to change that. Michael walked over, bent down to her level, and looked into her eyes one last time. I said yes. He finished. That there was nothing left to be saved. That everything they once were, everything they once built, everything they once meant to each other, had died the moment she chose another man. And that there was no going back from that. Sophia closed her eyes, letting the tears run down her face. He held the papers tightly against his chest, as if they were physical punishment. Michael stood up, and this time he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his bag, opened the door and left for good. Leaving behind not just a home, but an entire life that would never exist again. Michael drove aimlessly for hours, headlights cutting through the darkness of the road as the reality of everything that had happened began to settle in his mind. The road seemed endless, and every kilometer he left behind was one more memory he tried to bury. His chest was still heavy, but it was no longer anger that pulsed inside him, it was something denser, an almost suffocating emptiness that filled every corner of his being. He had won, if you could call it a victory. He left her with nothing, humiliated, destroyed. Sophia reaped exactly what she sowed, but then why did he feel like he still carried the weight of everything on his shoulders? Maybe because, despite everything, despite the betrayal, the blow, the pain, on some level, he still knew her. He could still visualize every feature of her face, he could still remember the sound of laughter that had once been his peace, he could still feel the touch that he had once considered home. But that time no longer existed. Now, she was just someone who was once part of your life. Someone who, even after everything, he didn't know if he could ever truly forget. He stopped the car at a deserted gas station, getting out to breathe the cold early morning air. The silence around him was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a radio playing inside the convenience store. He leaned against the car, passing his hands over his face, feeling the tiredness accumulated in his body. For the first time since it all started, he realized he didn't have a plan. He spent so much time focused on discovering the truth, on destroying the lie, that he never stopped to think about what would come next. What would he do now? Where would you go? What would happen to your life? For the first time in a long time, there were no answers. Just questions, one after another, filling the void that was now part of him. While filling the tank, he took out his cell phone and opened Sophia's latest messages. Some had not been read. They were desperate requests, words mixed with sobs, incoherent sentences that he could imagine being typed through tears. She said she was sorry, that she didn't know how to go on without him, that everything she did was a mistake that she would give anything to correct. But it was already too late for that. Nothing could be fixed now. He slid his finger across the screen, reading each message as if he were analyzing the last words of a person who no longer existed. Sophia was someone from the past. A memory that, sooner or later, would become just a distant detail of a life he would never live again. Michael returned to the car, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, but something inside him said that that weight would slowly dissipate. He needed to start over, he needed to find a new version of himself, someone who wasn't defined by what happened. But how? How do you move forward after something like this? He didn't want to carry bitterness with him for the rest of his life, he didn't want to be that man who drowns in resentment and lets pain transform him into something he's not. But I also didn't know how to just forget. The past was still a ghost, haunting every thought, every sensation. The next day, he woke up in a roadside motel, sunlight filtering through the dingy curtains of his cheap room. The smell of old coffee invaded his nostrils, but it brought no comfort. He picked up his cell phone and saw notifications of missed connections. Sophie. Once, twice, 3 times. She was still trying to reach him, still trying to say something, as if there was something to be said. He ignored the calls but hesitated before blocking the number. A part of him wanted to do this, wanted to get rid of any trace of that history, but another part, the part that still carried fresh scars, wanted to know how she was doing. I wanted to know if, after everything, she finally understood what she had done. He left his room and drove to a nearby cafe, ordering a cup without sugar, just to keep his hands busy. He sat next to the window, watching the movement of the street while trying to understand at what moment everything started to fall apart. Was it when he started to notice the signs, or was it earlier, much earlier, when the distance began to creep between them without either of them noticing? Was it always destined to end like this? Sophia was not just an unfaithful wife. She was someone who made bad choices, who crossed a line from which she could never return. But Michael also wondered, if he had been different, would things have turned out differently? Could it be that if he had noticed sooner, if he had said something, if he had fought for the marriage instead of just trusting that everything was okay, would she still have made the same decisions? But thinking about it now was useless. He knew that the past could not be rewritten. He paid the bill and returned to the car, feeling that something inside him was changing, albeit slowly. He no longer felt the same hatred that consumed him the night before. There was still pain, there were still marks that would take time to disappear, but the thirst for revenge, the desire to see her suffer, was dissipating. Maybe it was because he knew she was already suffering. Maybe because I knew that, in the end, no one came out victorious in that story. He destroyed her, but destroyed himself in the process. Both lost. He hit the road again, this time with a destination in mind. A new beginning. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that whatever it was, it would be different. And he was ready to find out. Michael drove for days without a clear destination, just moving away from everything he once called life. Every kilometer he left behind seemed to tear away a piece of the past, but at the same time, nothing inside him really changed. The weight was still there. The pain still pulsed beneath his skin. The silence inside the car became deafening, but he didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want voices, I didn't want music that could awaken memories. He just wanted the sound of the engine, of the road stretching out in front of him, as if at the end of it he could find something that made sense. One night, he stopped in a small town, where he found a discreet and empty bar. He sat at the counter, ordered a shot of whiskey and stood there, observing his reflection in the mirror in front of him. He no longer recognized himself. The eyes carried an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. What was left of him after all? He was just a man who lost everything, a man who was deceived, betrayed, manipulated. But was that all? Would the betrayal define the rest of his life? Lost in his thoughts, he almost didn't notice when a woman sat down next to him. She wasn't particularly flashy, but there was something about the way she carried herself that caught your attention. He looked like someone who, like him, carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just ordered a drink and stood there, staring at the counter. It was Michael who broke the silence, asking if she lived there. The woman laughed lightly, without humor, and said no, that she was just passing through, just like him. The conversation unfolded unexpectedly. Michael never saw himself as someone who shared his life with strangers, but there, in that bar, with this woman he would never see again, something inside him loosened. He said, superficially, that he had lost something important, that he felt trapped in his own past. She just nodded, without pressing him for details, as if she understood exactly what he meant. As the night progressed, she lightly touched his hand on the counter and asked him what he really wanted. Did you want revenge? Did you want Sophia to suffer more? Did you want to forget? Or did you just want to move on? Michael didn't know how to respond immediately. He thought he wanted all of this at the same time. But I knew none of these things would bring peace. He realized he was trapped not just by Sophia's betrayal, but by the fact that, for so long, his world had revolved around her. He was defined by marriage, by his role as a husband, by the love he felt for her. Now, without that, what was left? Who was he? The emptiness didn't just come from pain, but from the unknown. From uncertainty. He thanked her for the conversation and left before the night became too long. But her question kept echoing in his mind. He knew he couldn't keep running. Driving aimlessly wouldn't erase what happened. I needed to close that door once and for all. And to do that, he knew exactly what he needed to do. 2 days later, he returned to his old city. He passed in front of the house where he lived with Sophia, but didn't stop. He no longer belonged there. He went to a small cafe where he knew she used to go, and it wasn't long before he saw her. Sophia was sitting alone, her eyes downcast, picking at her coffee without any real interest. It seemed smaller than before. More fragile. Different from the woman he once knew. She looked up and saw him. The shock on his face was immediate. His eyes widened, his hands shook slightly as they held the cup. Michael came over, sat in the chair across from her, and said nothing for a moment. He let her speak first. Sophia tried to form words, but nothing seemed enough. She asked him why he was there, if he had come back to see her ruin, to make sure she was paying for everything she did. Michael shook his head, exhaling slowly. I said no. Who didn't come to see her suffer? But he needed something before leaving for good. I needed to understand. Sophia lowered her gaze, and for a moment, the silence between them was heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky. He said he had no excuses. That everything that happened was the result of your own weakness, your own insecurities. Who fell into Daniel's trap because she wanted to feel something new, because she wanted to escape the routine she created. But in the end, all he found was emptiness itself. He said he thought about him every day. That nothing that happened afterwards brought any kind of satisfaction. Who regretted it the moment she realized she was losing him. Michael heard everything in silence. I didn't expect to feel sorry, but I did. Not because he wanted to forgive her, but because he saw that, in a way, she also destroyed herself in the process. She broke the marriage, broke the trust, and in the end, broke herself. He said he didn't hate her anymore. That as much as he wanted to just feel anger, as much as he wanted to see her as the villain of the story, he knew it was more complex than that. I knew that people make mistakes. I knew that sometimes life takes paths that no one planned. But I also knew I couldn't stay stuck in that anymore. That I could no longer look back. Sophia started to cry, but this time, she didn't ask him to stay. Just thanked you for coming. She was grateful for not leaving her alone with the guilt, for allowing them to at least have this last moment of truth. Michael stood up, leaving some notes on the table, and looked at her one last time. He said he hoped she would find a way to move on. That he learned from all that. That he no longer destroyed anything out of fear of facing his own life. Then he left. And this time, he didn't feel the need to look back. Michael never thought life could change so drastically in such a short time. He left the city without looking back, without carrying anything other than the weight of what happened. For weeks, he didn't establish roots, he didn't plan anything, he just lived in the present, letting time carry the pain. But time didn't erase everything. Some scars remained forever. Even though he no longer felt the same fury, there was still an echo of everything he had been through, a constant reminder that life can fall apart at any moment. But there was something different now, he no longer felt the emptiness. Little by little, he realized that he could move on, that there was something beyond that story, that he wasn't defined by Sophia's betrayal, that there was a whole world waiting to be lived. In a distant city, he found a new routine. He got a different job than he had done before, something less exhausting, less meticulous, something that didn't require him to spend hours on end in meetings that meant little. For the first time in years, he felt like he had control over his own life. And then, he met someone. It wasn't planned, it wasn't something he sought, but it happened. At first it was just an unpretentious conversation, then another, until, without realizing it, he found himself smiling for real, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. But this time, he decided to take it easy. He didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, he didn't want to lose himself in illusions. He learned to read the signs, to understand what really mattered. This time, he wouldn't accept less than he deserved. Meanwhile, Sophia lived a very different reality. The weight of the betrayal was not just emotional, but financial. Without the money that once flowed seamlessly from her account, without the house she once called home, without the stability that marriage offered her, she found herself forced to face life like never before. Daniel, the man she destroyed everything for, disappeared without a trace, taking with him not only part of her money, but also any trace of affection she once thought existed between them. She tried to rebuild her life, tried to seek support, but discovered that when everything falls apart, few people remain. Friends who once surrounded her disappeared, family members who once supported her now avoided contact. Her name was marked. Not as a victim, but as someone who destroyed his own life with his own hands. She tried to move on, tried to ignore the guilt that was gnawing at her, but it was all over her. In the silence of her nights alone, in the judgmental looks she received when she met acquaintances, in the unanswered messages, in the calls that were never returned. Everything he once had, everything he once was now just a bitter memory. She thought about looking for Michael, thought about asking for forgiveness once again, but she knew it would be no use. She knew he would never look at her the same way again. And deep down, I knew he was right to move on without looking back. Life went on. For each of them, in different ways. Michael found his peace, his second chance, a new beginning he never imagined possible. Sophia, on the other hand, was stuck in the consequences of her choices. There was no new beginning for her, only the pain of what could have been. And so, everyone went their own way. Him, for a new life. Her, for an uncertain future. Now, I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Do you believe Sophia got what she deserved, or do you think Michael should have forgiven her? Comment below and share your views on this turnaround. And of course, if you liked this story and want to hear more impactful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and leave a like. Here, we tell stories that stir your emotions and bring deep reflections on life and relationships. And remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating. Until next time.